Several attendees are still logging in. The number's increasing, so we'll give a few more minutes and then we'll get started. But thanks for joining us this afternoon or this morning, depending upon where you are. Hello, everybody. I'm Dan Russell. I'm Chief Client Advisor at Surety Systems. Been in the consulting industry for business applications and businesses for over 25 years. I have with me a couple other panel members I'll talk about in a second. Really excited to put this on. The way this came about was we jointly hosted a brain date at Workday Rising with Jessica Hall, who's our subject matter expert on this call today, and it was sold out. And so we thought there's obviously pent up demand and interest in learning more about Workday's learning. So the goal of today is to, one, share information about Workday's learning platform, but also talk about best practices and lessons learned from many implementations that we've been part of to help you out. And then we want to make this more interactive than most webinars. And so we're going to have open Q&A throughout the webinar. So now let me just talk a little bit about the intros and the agenda. So the approach we're going to use is we have three main topics. The first is what is Workday Learning at kind of an overview at the macro level that Jessica will walk you through. And then we'll take some open Q&A that you have about Workday's platform, as several of you are still considering Workday's platform. Some have picked it and are thinking about implementing, and a few might have already implemented or looking at enhancing. The second piece is how do you optimize the Workday Learning Management systems? And Jessica's going to talk about the best practices that she's seen. And then the final section is going to be advanced configuration nuances. What we're going to do on the Q&A is everybody will submit questions through the tool, through the webinar tool, and then we will bring those to Jessica, and we're going to do it after each section. So as questions come to your mind, go ahead and enter them in. And then when we get a break between each section, we will handle those questions that have come in at that point in time, and then have further open Q&A at the end of the session today. So hopefully you all get a lot of benefit out of this, and you can learn more about Workday and more about how other people have leveraged it and what best practices you might apply as you start to think about implementing your Workday environments. So now let me do some quick intros of the panel. I already mentioned myself. With me is one of my colleagues, Steve Logue. He's been with Surety for over 15 years, and he's been working in the Workday space as a client advisor for over 10 years. Surety as a whole, we've been in business 23 years. We've worked with over 500 companies, and we have over 10 years of experience with Workday. Pretty much as Workday was first getting off the ground is when Surety started getting off the ground with our Workday practice. We're really happy today to have one of our key consultants, Jessica Hall, on the phone with us. She has over 15 years of learning management experience, and she has experience with over 12 different learning management systems. She is an expert level resource in the Workday space, but also has good knowledge of other learning management systems, how they compare, how they differ, and she'll talk through some of that as she walks through Workday today. So now I'm going to turn it over to Jessica, and she has a handful of slides here to kind of overview the Workday Learning offering and some of the elements of how it's set up for both the user side and for the administrator side. And then we'll start to drive into some of the best practices from there. So Jessica.
Thanks so much, Dave. I'm sorry, Dan. I am seeing, here we go. It looks like I have control now. So thank you for the intro. Like they mentioned, I have about 15 years or so in LMS experience, a lot of that has been on the Workday end of things. I came into the Workday ecosystem by way of learning and development and organizational development. And so I'm really coming in with sort of that background of knowledge of how things function day to day in Workday or in the business. And so I like to work with my clients and really ask those questions of like, what are the problems we're trying to solve and how can we solve that with Workday, rather than just sort of a one size fits all approach. Workday Learning is a little bit different than a lot of LMSs. I've worked with around 15 different, 12 to 15 different LMSs over my career. The majority of that has been when converting to Workday Learning, so helping clients convert their data and their processes from whatever they're going to Workday Learning. But I have certainly worked more immersively in some other LMSs as well in my time before coming into the Workday ecosystem. But the one thing that really sets, I think, Workday apart from others is the touch points that it has with the other areas of Workday. There's not really another LMS out there that I'm aware of that is so ingrained in your core HCM data. That's really, to me, that's the big benefit of Workday Learning, because you're able to take that data and analyze it atop your learning data in a way that's just really not possible. So what you're seeing on your screen now is sort of a flow chart of all of the data touch points that exist between learning and other areas of Workday. I'm not going to spend a ton of time here, but feel free to grab a screenshot of this if you'd like. It's one of those things that we kind of take for granted in Workday if you're not really looking at the data that closely. But things like Skills Cloud on the talent side, and whether or not you're doing any type of like career mobility things with mentorship or Career Hub on talent optimization really play into Workday. But your core HCM data is another thing that integrates with Workday Learning in a way that's just not possible. So you could, isolate parts of your workforce based on whatever dimensions are reportable off of that worker, and distribute learning to them. So that might be, getting really granular with some of your audiences and your campaigns, which we'll talk about here a little bit later. So I would say definitely consider this. If you have any questions related to specific touch points between Workday, feel free to put those in the chat, and we will absolutely answer those as time allows here. But we can go ahead and move forward. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the content hierarchy and how that differs within Workday Learning. The terminology is primarily the difference, but people do sometimes get hung up on this, so I just wanted to kind of level set with our terminology. Starting from the bottom here, the smallest piece of learning content that exists within Workday is a lesson. It can be a standalone piece of media, so think a quiz or a video or a PDF document that could just be distributed on its own. That would be a lesson. A course is your most common piece of learning content, and it can be comprised of multiple lessons or just one lesson. But those things, they can be distributed. So they can be distributed to learners through any number of different distribution channels. And the courses can be graded, and they can have many other sort of criteria associated with them. And then at the top here of the content hierarchy is a program. And so if you're coming from something like Cornerstone or SuccessFactors, they may call this a curriculum, but this is essentially what that is in Workday, where it's sort of like a playlist where we can enforce the delivery order of content. And those courses can be delivered in such a way that you can require completion of the prior item before the next item opens up. And so it's sort of like a customized user experience. We're going to enforce a lesson order or a course order, or we're going to enforce certain behavior from this content and deliver it like all bundled together. So just keep those terminology in mind as we talk through this. Lesson is the smallest piece, course is the most common piece, and then a program is sort of one way of bundling that content together. So we'll move forward. There's two types of courses in Workday Learning. This is pretty typical of every LMS these days, but your digital courses are probably your most common. Those are your SCORM packages. Workday can support SCORM packages and does offer quite a bit of reportability on SCORM packages. So you can get very granular in your reporting. So things like length of time spent in the learning module, individual interactions on non-graded pieces of content, and obviously the things that you collect as part of the typical SCORM package, which are like overall grade and score and things like that. And then we have our blended courses. Blended courses are sort of an enhancement of digital courses where you can also have a SCORM package if you would like, but in the same way that all courses can have multiple lessons within them, it may or must also contain at least one instructor-led element, and that can be either virtual or in person. So blended courses will always have a time, date, and location associated with them, and that time, date, and location is what Workday calls the offering. So your blended courses will always have an offering, and your digital courses are strictly online only. It's primarily the differentiator factor there. Your content can be bundled in a number of different ways. Like we talked before, you have the ability to bundle lessons and courses within a program. Also, you can bundle that content and deliver it via a campaign, which we'll talk about a little bit later in more detail. You also have the ability to set learning paths or learning programs. Learning paths are sort of learner-led. Think of them at like a playlist, like you would find on YouTube, where a learner can find curated content and sort of set it up for themselves to watch later, sort of like that. They can also be shared between learners. So if you have learning content that maybe a leader has created for their team, that can be shared with everyone in that same job or shared with others across the organization. And then learning programs we talked about briefly, which are those sort of admin created programs where we're enforcing a particular order and we're driving a particular behavior with that content. This, I think, is probably the biggest change of Workday Learning coming from a different LMS. For a lot of people, when they're coming into the Workday ecosystem for the first time, this is something they get really hung up on and sometimes very confused about moving into Workday Learning. Workday differentiates between an assignment and an enrollment. And they sort of work together, but they are two separate entities. So an assignment is what occurs in Workday when you deliver the training to a user. And an enrollment occurs when that learner starts a course or selects an offering or is enrolled by someone, like a manager or an administrator. So an example of that is you might distribute learning content through a campaign, and that campaign assigns a new hire orientation program to the learners. And that program has some digital courses and some blended courses. And one of those blended courses, they would have to select an offering. Within that offering, they would be able to enroll in the offering that makes sense for them, maybe based on their schedule. That's one example of being delivered content through a campaign. The campaign creates an assignment, and then the learner takes some action on that content they were assigned to select an offering, and that is when the enrollment occurs. It can all happen pretty seamlessly, or they can be separated out quite a bit. Workday's recently made some changes to the way that assignments and enrollments work together and have additional changes coming with the next release that are going to make it so that some of this can be more automated. But the two entities are kind of separate. And then just below the break here, I have the 3 color-coded boxes just showing kind of some of the differentiating factors between waiving assignments, dropping enrollments, and canceling enrollments. Because waive, drop, and cancel are also terminology that kind of get misused sometimes. So kind of understanding who is doing what. So let's say that you need to waive an assignment. That means the learner maybe no longer needs to complete the course at all and doesn't need to receive any reminders for retraining. At that point, it would be an admin-initiated waive. It would no longer show in their required for you slider, and it waives that requirement to complete. And then your other two that I have over here, the blue and the green box, relate to enrollments. And so those are specific to the learning content that the learner has already interacted with or been enrolled in. And in that case, the learner could elect to drop, or the admin could drop on their behalf, or the learner could be in a canceled enrollment if you choose to cancel that enrollment. Canceled enrollments would appear on their learner transcript, and there would be essentially no record that's learner facing that that individual had ever been enrolled in that content. I would say This is another one that you may want to grab a quick screenshot of and share with your learning teams if you're moving into Workday Learning, but this is a little cheat sheet for some of the terminology that comes up if you think that might be helpful. Let's move on to the next slide. The next thing I want to just briefly touch on within Workday specifically that I think is very robust is ways of segmenting your employee populations or your worker populations and defining your learning audiences. So we talked briefly about campaigns and that's a way of distributing learning content. But how do you determine who you're distributing content to, right? So you would want to identify your audience. There's a lot of different ways that you can identify audiences in Workday. And there's sort of a light, a regular, and a hard mode for doing that. And different levels of effort associated with what you're trying to solve for, right? The most basic form of an audience is just a search report where maybe you're looking for everyone in a particular job profile and you just want to isolate quickly everyone and say, hey, everyone in this particular job profile should get all of this training. And that's a really straightforward way of identifying your audience. I work with a lot of organizations that have a lot more complex rules than that, though. And so while that's great for sort of your low-hanging fruit, a lot of times there are really complex audience requirements. Maybe something like everyone within this call center except for these job profiles, except for anyone reporting to this manager. And so you can get really complex in what your criteria actually looks like. And so Workday allows you to define those audiences using custom reporting. So this is, again, I think the way that Workday is really, really different than a lot of other LMSs because you can use virtually any dimension that is reportable on the worker as criteria in your audience. And a lot of that data doesn't exist in other LMS systems. So Workday will allow you to pull in virtually anything that you can report off of the worker and say, I need to segment the population by this criteria and then build conditional logic around that. So the audience feature of Workday, I think is probably one of the more robust features and something that I've not really encountered in other LMSs that is quite as robust. In the graphic on the right-hand side, I've tried to kind of show those three different audience options. So your custom report, your saved search, and the one in the middle, audience builder. Audience builder is new, and it's sort of in between in levels of complexity. It's a little bit more robust than a saved search, but it's not going to require you to have custom reporting knowledge. So this can be really good for assigning things in mass if you have just a straightforward audience that you don't need that level of complexity for. And then on the usage sort of column, there's just a few different ways of distributing those assignments or enrollments. So just letting you know sort of what the use case is for each of those audiences. And there's some situations where you might want to use one over the other, but certainly you can use your audience builder to feed campaigns, but you could also use custom reports to feed campaigns, things like that. Mm-hmm. So things to consider with a Workday.
Let's pause here, maybe Jessica, for a second, give everybody a chance to just ask questions about Workday's learning management system. One question that came in is, what do you see as some of the core differences of the way Workday was designed and built versus maybe more traditional learning management systems that you've seen in the past?
Yeah, so Workday was sort of built from the ground up to almost mirror the way that a higher education platform works. And so our content is organized in a way that's really familiar to people who are looking at like a course catalog, right? In fact, that's what the content library in Workday is called, is catalog, a learning catalog. And so if you've ever gone on any like higher ed website and looked for, content to enroll in, for a semester, it's a similar view to that, in that you have topics within that learning catalog and content can be broken up into topics. We can also secure things so that different groups of users have visibility into different segments of the learning content. And so you may have maybe some technical training that is just for your IT teams, or maybe you're a retail or a healthcare organization and you have some job specific training that you need to go just to a specific audience. And you don't want the rest of the organization to even be able to self-service access that learning. You don't want it to be visible to them at all. You can actually secure things at the topic level or at the individual course level so that you can define who can see what in your organization. So I think that the content library and sort of being structured based on topics, giving the ability to kind of search through, I think that's fairly different in Workday from just a user perspective.
Jessica, another question that came in is, Workday chose to separate the assignment from the enrollment, and that sounds like a difference. What's the business value of why they did that and how it brings more value to our company?
I think it's a valuable reporting dimension, because you can see essentially who has actioned something versus someone who's just been told to complete it. I will say that particularly as it relates to campaigns, it has been a kind of a friction point in the past where some customers have come up with solutions to auto-enroll people so that there is no need to take action. But interacting with the course in any way. So let's say I'm assigned a course. Maybe it's a digital course, maybe it's a blended course, it doesn't matter in this scenario, but I'm assigned something. I get a notification saying I'm assigned this course by my manager. It's due in 30 days. I need to log into Workday to complete the course. As soon as I click on that course in Workday Learning, I'll see it in my required for you space. As soon as I click on that, I've created an enrollment. And so it's then reportable sort of when the learner actions that learning content. Also from a standpoint of retraining. So let's say that it's a course that maybe is due again in 90 days or expires after a year. All of that expiry information is related to when the course was assigned, not necessarily when the course was enrolled in. And so you can have an expiry window that's based on, they're due annually based on the assignment date and not based on the enrollment date. If someone is, for example, on leave or just not super responsive in the system. Good question.
Jessica, we have one more question, and then we'll move forward into your optimizing LMS best practices. And for any of the attendees, just go into the Q&A section if you want to enter additional questions, and we'll monitor those and feed those to her. The final question is, we already have Workday Financials and HR implemented, but we're using another LMS system. What are the benefits of moving over onto Workday's learning management system over keeping it separate with our prior systems?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think it's a very individualized conversation for every business, right? But ultimately, I would say the biggest value of having the learning content in Workday is the ability to blend that data with your HCM data. So let's say that you're an organization that's maybe moving towards Skills Cloud and deployment on the talent side. Like maybe you're using Workday Skills Cloud to gather skills. Maybe you're using Career Hub to inform employee growth and mobility. Or maybe you're rolling out Workday Recruiting. And you want to be able to better identify talent within your organization and address skills gaps that might be keeping people from moving into roles that they're interested in. So if you are deploying Workday Learning, you now have the ability to capture all of that data in one system. So an employee could let's say, indicate their interest by filling out their career profile, and they say, I have this education, I have this experience, I have these skills, here's where I'm interested in going in my career. So we have that data on the talent side. We also have data on the learning side that says this learning content is associated with people in similar roles to where they are now. And this other set of learning content is associated with people in roles where they are wanting to go in the future. And so Workday Learning can actually serve up learning content to address any skills gaps that exist between point A and point B. Again, that's assuming that you have the data in Workday and that you're collecting skills data and you're collecting the talent data, but it can be a really valuable tool in upskilling your workforce because it's all right there and pre-populated, usually by the workers, even before a learning implementation, you're already using some of the talent functionality. So I would say that's a really big benefit. Steve, I see your hand up. Oh, goodbye.
So I'm trying to kind of combine those for you. So I guess the quick, easy one we'll address is mobile. So what are the options for mobile learning?
Workday Learning is enabled on mobile. It is, I would say, as good a user experience on mobile as your content will allow for. So some of the SCORM packages certainly are less fun on mobile, depending on how they're authored, right? But that's really more of an instructional design indication than it is a Workday Learning indication. But the content that's delivered through Workday, so let's say maybe it's something with video interactions that's delivered through Workday. That's a tool that Workday has that I didn't even cover in this presentation, that allows you to add sort of lightweight questionnaires on top of video content without needing a course offering tool like a SCORM package or something. Let's say that you have content like that, or maybe it's just a digital course that is sort of optimized for mobile viewing. I think it's a really good user experience. I think we also have the ability for assessors and instructors to manage grading and attendance, and I believe that that is also available on mobile with the most recent update as well.
Okay, and then the next two, I think we can kind of combine into one. So it's specifically about Cornerstone. So one person asked about the data migration process, and then from a specific Cornerstone, any advice, learnings, and I know we tackled one of those together. The SCORM packages came up in the data migration, so maybe we can kind of roll those into one.
Yeah, so Cornerstone in particular, I think Cornerstone as well as a couple others like SuccessFactors and things like that do a pretty good job of giving you some HCM data. And usually a lot of the clients I work with already have some sort of integration set up between core Workday and those LMS systems to feed updated HCM data into it. So you're sort of referencing some of what Workday can do, right? Like obviously not everything, but you're getting things like supervisory org and workers manager and some of the more basic dimensions. The thing that I would caution you about when going to Workday Learning from Cornerstone or any other LMS really is you really want to take the time to evaluate your content, of course, but your audiences in your campaigns, because Workday is going to give you so many more dimensions to slice and dice your population by that oftentimes what I find is those audiences actually end up being less complex when moved into Workday. And so I've worked on a few projects where it's sort of a lift and shift approach of, oh, here's what we have in Cornerstone. We just want to move it to Workday. But if you actually take the time and really work through those audiences and like, what is the problem we're trying to solve for? And you have someone on your team that is well-versed in Workday, either core HCM or learning, and can kind of guide you through crafting those audiences within Workday, you will end up with a better product overall. You'll have less users that are accidentally assigned learning that they shouldn't have been, and you'll be able to manage it more easily on the back end once you're live, if you are able to clean up those audiences during data migration. The other thing that I would say, and this again I think applies to any LMS migration tool, is consider what content you want to put in Workday, and whether or not that is every piece of content you have in your LMS today, or if you want to load historical learning data, but not necessarily the courses that are now inactive that were maybe offered 5 or 6 years ago. You have the ability to do it either way, but I find that for most organizations, there's a good balance of both. So you may want to load in data that's active or has been active for the last year, but just load in historical learning records going back 7 years or 5 years or whatever makes sense from a regulatory or compliance perspective for your organization. But you certainly have the ability to not migrate the content, but migrate the record that the content was consumed. If that makes sense.
It does. And there was another one. I think the best way to approach this is you may cover this, Jessica, in your next one. So it's piggybacking on the Cornerstone piece, but I think they wanted to specifically, the limitations they have currently in Cornerstone doesn't handle multi-job. So they're wanting to talk about, multi-job and reporting and assignments. So again, if that is in this next piece, then maybe we can kind of build that in.
Yeah, no, that I think that's a good segue into the next piece. But yeah, so Workday handles multi-job very, very well. And that is a limitation of a lot of other LMSs. Right now, I have a client, actually a shared client with Steve, that they are a healthcare organization and they have, nurses that use, maybe in one job profile primarily, but they may have 3, 4, or 5 alternate jobs under different managers. It is possible in Workday to give visibility into all of those supporting managers for the learning content that maybe their teams and the people they support need. And also you can build your audiences around like every supervisory org or every manager an individual has. So again, it's one of those things that there may not be a Workday delivered field for it, but you can always build calculated fields for it and build your audience around whatever. So I have this other client that actually just this week, I was helping them through a very similar situation where we need to build an audience for a group of people. And some of these people have 4 or 5 different jobs. We need to make sure their managers, all of their managers can see all of the learning content. We want to make sure that we're distributing this to, notifications to everyone. So Workday does a really, really good job of managing multiple jobs, I would say.
All right, Jessica, why don't you talk through some of the best practices that you've learned through the years?
Absolutely. So I would say considering user experience the entire way through design is really important. A lot of people during design sessions are sort of answering the question that is asked of them and not thinking about what the answer to that question is going to impose on the user. And so and you don't really get to that point until you're in the testing phase of your project. So you've made all of these decisions early on without consideration for user experience and find later that, oh, well, we could have actually probably done this a little bit differently and not run into, confusion, things like that. So I would say to the extent that you can, always consider what the user is going to see as a result of the decisions that you make in design. Think about your reportability needs when you're designing or importing content. So I touched on that a little bit earlier when I mentioned that you can import content entirely, like this form package, along with the learning history, or you can just do a historical learning record for the learner that doesn't have the content in Workday, but shows a reportable record of it on their transcript. And then there's also the newly created content, things like SCORM standards, where when you author your courses, you want to be mindful of what standard you're publishing them in, because different standards will give you different levels of reportability within Workday. So if you have the luxury of building new content to put into Workday Learning, like for example, I've worked with clients that their LMS was their primary authoring tool, and they didn't use Electora or Captivate or anything like that to build content. It was all authored in their LMS. So it was proprietary to that LMS. And so that client had to rebuild all of their learning content, which was a big project, right? But it gave them the opportunity to build it and publish it using a new SCORM standard that allowed for a lot more robust reportability than what they had previously. The next bullet point I have is to understand the key differences between assignment and enrollment really early on in your project, kind of differentiating those two so that as you're going through your design sessions with your implementation partner, you're able to kind of speak to the differences and understand how the two relate to each other. And then this one, if I could give you one piece of advice that I could put in bold and highlight, it's that when you're looking at implementing Workday Learning, make sure that you give your learning admins 2 things: report writer and access to the HCM staffing, the domain for staffing, current staffing information for workers. Those 2 things are going to be really critical for your learning admins to have. And they're technically, because again, Workday's everything, they're technically HCM domains. So sometimes I work on learning implementations that are really siloed. Maybe it's a phase X deployment, or maybe it's a large learning deployment as part of a larger HCM rollout, but your teams are not talking to each other. And so I've actually worked with clients who have gone live in Workday without the ability to do a lot of stuff that learning admins need to be able to do, like slicing and dicing your population by all of these worker-based dimensions, because all of that's secured to HCM data. And if you don't give your learning admins that access, they can't sort of view people or segment people based on that. So I would say definitely a little life hack is report writer and worker data current staffing information domain. You want to definitely give access to. And then I know we want to spend some time for open Q&A. I think I've covered most of this. Do we have any other questions before we move on?
Just let's go ahead and move through the advanced configuration nuances, and then we'll take the final round of questions that people submit through the Q&A.
Sounds good. So more kind of advanced configuration things to consider. Workday out of the box gives you a learning administrator security group. I do often see that more nuanced configuration is needed for lower level support. So that could be things like a learning partner that kind of acts like a talent partner or an HR business partner type role, where they can control learning content and distribute learning content for their groups that they manage or support. I've also seen things like content creator or something like that that's like a learning admin light that is creating learning content but maybe not distributing that learning content. So if you are at the stage of your implementation where you're thinking about the scoping of the project, you might want to consider the fact that Workday out of the box really only comes with learning administrator, and there may be lower level roles from your legacy LMS that you want to replicate in Workday. I've not encountered any scenarios that couldn't be supported there in terms of like what level of access this individual need, because the learning domains are set up in such a way that you can kind of slice and dice it and segment out security to the right groups. But just keep that in mind as you're answering questions about design, or as you're having those kind of initial fact-finding conversations. And then the other thing I would say that I think is really, really important for driving adoption and better user experience is custom dashboarding. Workday delivers a learning dashboard that is pretty good. A lot of the content on there is content that you'll need from day one. I would say the area that Workday doesn't really address is contextually grouping things together. So let's take the learning admin dashboard, for example. If you get that out of the box as Workday delivers it, it's going to kind of have all of the tasks that admins do kind of jumbled together. I would actually recommend taking some time and rebuilding that as a custom dashboard where you're maybe grouping things contextually about like, this tab is for managing content. This tab is for distributing content. This tab is for all of your reporting. Maybe this is your compliance area over here, so that you can kind of empower your users, particularly your admins or your super users, to kind of self-service within the system because everything is given to them contextually. I'm a big fan of customized contextual user design, user interface design. I feel like it drives, we have the data to support that it drives better user adoption, right? So if you give someone a user interface that looks pretty, but all of the sort of bits and bobs are just sort of arbitrarily lumped together, it can be very overwhelming and not intuitive for them. So really think again about user experience as you're at the stage in your project where you're about to roll this out. Maybe you're handed off your project at the end by your learning implementers, and you have some time before it goes live to your population to really refine those dashboards and reporting and make it make sense to the end user. I think that's really important. And then the other thing that I would point out as well is custom reporting for different personas. And by personas, I mean things like manager, your LMS admin, maybe an HR auditor, maybe a learner, individual like employee itself. You can build those custom reports to distribute the same content for different audiences and sort of pre-populate that. So giving managers the ability to see like my team's upcoming in-person training, for example, on their manager dashboard and giving the employee the visibility to do the same thing on their learner dashboard and giving admins the ability to maybe like track out of compliance learners for that same type of content on their dashboard. The same sort of report with minor tweaks, again, contextually for the audience that it's going to, I think is really important. Any
Thanks.
other questions?
Yeah, I believe a few more questions that come in, Steve.
Yeah, there was just kind of asking about some of the reporting enhancements. Do you have kind of any recommendations around, I guess, maybe reporting and then actually that probably ties in. I just want to make sure we addressed on the multi-job question earlier, Jessica. They specifically asked about handling that with reporting and assignments. So maybe we touch on that.
Yeah. So in terms of just general enhancements for reporting, I tend to recommend a handful of reports to every learning client that will make it easier to do any type of auditing you need to do as a learning admin, and to populate EIBs if you ever need to make an adjustment like a mass load, or if you're wanting to waive something in mass and load that through EIB. So I build reports that include like your, say, assignment, for an example, but the same thing would apply for an enrollment. But say you build a report that's all learning assignments, but you're going to want to add things on there like the Workday ID. You're going to want to add things on there like your worker information, like what supervisory org they report to and what manager they report to. There's also things that you can do on the enrollment side to pull in individual lesson level tracking. So if you're in a course that has multiple lessons, like maybe 5 lessons, you can actually report out on individual lesson attainment. And so there's an overall course score, but you may have other areas of your course that are graded as well. And so you can report out on that. And both of those scenarios would be custom reporting that are a little bit different than what Workday delivers. Workday delivers good reports for learning admins. I just think that most users end up having a use case for a handful of additional reports. There is also on Workday's Customer Central tenant, which every Workday customer has access to something called a Customer Central tenant. Workday has on there another dashboard for learning admins. It's a learning compliance dashboard that gives some additional more complex reporting and a lot of skills-based reporting. So if you're interested in that touch point between like Skills Cloud and Workday Learning, I would definitely recommend checking out the Learning Compliance Dashboard on your Customer Central tenant, because you can usually just import that right over and sort of hit the ground running with it. I want to make sure as well that I answered the question around multi-position. Steve, from your perspective, is there anything that I could clarify on that?
I mean, I think, so I can read verbatim. So they're on Workday for HCM and Cornerstone for LMS, and they're replicating many of their Workday fields in Cornerstone, but only for primary jobs since Cornerstone doesn't handle multi-job. And then it said, can you speak to handling multi-jobs staff for reporting and assignments? I think you touched on most of it, but.
So I can tell you from a very technical detail, if some of you on the call are report writers, the way that I build that to pull into reporting and audiences and all of your analytics, your notifications, everything, is rather than reporting on or assigning based on the worker's supervisory org, I build a calculated field to look up all positions for the worker, and a calculated field from that to look up all of the supervisory orgs where those positions sit. And then I assign based on the calculation of my calculation, which is kind of a roundabout way of doing it, but it gives me every supervisory org that individual rolls up to in any position. And that can be done on any worker-based report in all of Workday, including your assignments, including your mass enrollments, notifications, manager reports. If you guys are using like report bursting to distribute reports to audiences, you can use it for that. But yes, multi-job on the learning front is, I think, one of the areas where Workday is a lot more capable than a lot of the other LMSs.
Okay, and then to piggyback off that, Jessica, there's a pretty straightforward question about when learning is assigned, does this show up in the regular Workday inbox?
It does. So depending on how you assign it, you do have some control over what type of notifications are sent, right? But let's say that it's assigned from a campaign and it's required learning. You would set up an initial notification as well as potentially reminders on that campaign so that when someone has campaigned out that learning, they're notified of it, and they might be notified leading up to its due date or after its due date, depending on how you set it up. So you can set up reminders to go based on the delivery date or based on the due date. So they would be notified there. They also would be notified through their learning dashboard on, again, if it was a required assignment, it would show on their required for you when they first log into Workday Learning. And then depending on what your organization has set up at the tenant level, you also have the ability to get either real-time sort of push notifications or a daily digest of once per day. Here's everything for you in Workday, depending on what you have set up in your tenant. So they would get notified via email that way or by push notification that way.
Okay. Yeah, because that was actually part 2 of the question. I just didn't hit see all was just if a course hadn't been completed, yeah, how do you ensure and remind them? So it sounds like you can push it out and automated.
Yep, absolutely.
All right. And then another one here is as far as just storing content, is there any limitations in size and amount of videos that you run into?
I will say the individual storage capacity that you have is probably something that is in your individual Workday contract. I have never encountered a storage limit issue when it comes to loading in data. I would refer to your customer success manager to look at your individual Workday contract. But it's going to be, depending on when you signed your Workday contract, it's either going to be under the learning SKU or under something called Media Cloud. And that will give you all of the details of what type of, how much storage is available. But I've done a dozen or so Workday Learning implementations in some capacity or another, either the actual implementation or support shortly thereafter. And I've never encountered a situation where there wasn't adequate storage. I've also worked with really big clients that were concerned about bandwidth and about like pushing learning out to a large number of users at once, and that potentially slowing tenant performance. And there are things that Workday can do to prioritize some jobs over other jobs. So if you're concerned about volume during your implementation phase, that's definitely something that your implementation partner would work with you on. And if you meet a certain threshold, then you would work with Workday to prioritize certain jobs. And basically that changes, the order that they're run in your tenant in the background to make sure that tenant performance isn't impacted.
And then Jessica, right before Rising, there was quite a bit of acquisitions and things announced. There was a question as far as their acquisition of Sana. Do you have any kind of thoughts on, the outlook? I know it's early stages, but just your take on, what impacts they may have on Workday Learning.
At Rising, they Carl said the phrase, AI is the new UI. And I definitely am curious to see what that looks like. I will say that I don't know what the user interface will change into. I think they're likely going to continue to enhance a lot of the things that they've been working on for many years. That was machine learning before it was AI, but things like your Skills Cloud touch points and all the ways that all of the different sort of Workday SKUs touch each other. So I'm very interested to see how that is enhanced by some of this. Serving up recommendations for learners, I think, could be enhanced, but I couldn't begin to speculate what the user interface is actually going to look like. That's one thing that I would sort of caution you guys of, because I think Workday's UI is probably in a period of some rapid transition, is when you're thinking about your change management and user materials that don't reference things like click the green button in the upper right-hand corner, because that may not be a green button in the upper right-hand corner in one release or two releases. But I would say that I think there'll be small iterative changes. They're not going to just completely serve up a new UI. It will be things that can be sort of adapted over time. And Workday does do a pretty good job of having things be opt-in or opt-out for at least 1 to 2 releases after they become available. So your organization has time to adapt.
Yeah, I mean, and I feel like just in the discussions of acquisitions while we're Rising, there seemed to be a consensus of almost a 2-year kind of before you might really fully see the impacts unless you're already an existing user. There was a question that came through on how will learning progress and completions automatically affect other Workday modules. So they're referencing performance management, talent development.
So you can do a lot with Workday Learning in that regard. Out of the box, like automatically, I wouldn't say that there's much there other than like if you're using things like Career Hub and you have the Manager Insights Hub enabled, managers will see learning data alongside performance data. So they may be looking at things like a corrective action or disciplinary action or a PIP alongside learning content, sort of in one blended view, but nothing automatically happens based on learning content, but you can do lots of things in a very customized way. So for example, you can, if you're flagging your learning content to identify what is like a regulatory compliance course in some way, maybe it's a topic, maybe it's some identifier on the course to indicate that it's a regulatory course. You can build custom reporting to identify workers who have completed that overdue or not completed it in, when they should have. And that can feed into embedded analytics on performance reviews. It can feed into reports on corrective actions or disciplinary actions that you're using. You can also set up alert jobs to trigger based on that report. So if you're building a report to notify you of everyone who comes overdue on their regulatory and compliance training, that report could then send a notification to like a talent partner role, and that talent partner could take appropriate action and maybe start a corrective action for that individual based on the fact that they're overdue on this regulatory and compliance training. It's not something that is out of the box already set up for you. You would have to build the report and tell it what to do, but that's a pretty common thing that I build quite often, in some sort of alert to notify when a particular course or group of courses is not completed in a timely manner. Those can also be pulled into other tasks as well. So things like embedded analytics on compensation reviews or talent reviews. We can pull in data related to how many compliance courses were overdue by this learner and the review period, things like that.
And so, Jessica, I'm going to try to, for the sake of time, summarize a few questions here. There's just some components from a healthcare perspective. Obviously, you and I have worked on that. So any nuances related to Epic, and then my head goes to, clinical competencies that are typically integrated. Yeah. So maybe touch on a little bit of that.
Oh, goodness. That could be a whole separate hour-long webinar on clinical competencies. So since it's healthcare specific, I don't want to spend a ton of time there, but I will say, yes, healthcare organizations, healthcare and manufacturing are the two industries that I think have the most industry-specific requirements for learning, and with good reason, right? They can be very complex. I would say for both of those industries, both healthcare and manufacturing, your audiences are going to be really key there, because you're going to have to probably have very complex audiences. Workday does a good job with those audiences. So it's really just an exercise in building those out. For Epic specifically, I don't see a lot of people integrating Epic directly with Workday, but certainly I've seen Epic specific training within Workday Learning. And then your clinical competencies are obviously something. I've worked with a couple of clients, including two right now that are healthcare organizations that are reporting clinical competencies in Workday. So there's a couple of different methods for doing that, as well as Workday has a observational checklist that is going to be released with the next release in spring 2024. So 3 or 4 different methods of reporting clinical competencies that I'm aware of for sure in Workday.
Okay, so I think we're going to try to summarize on the last questions here. I mean, it's hitting back on Cornerstone, just any functional gaps between those, and then if time permits, boomerang use cases.
I am not aware of any functional limitations. I will say my experience with Cornerstone has been almost exclusively migration from Cornerstone to Workday, right? And so I'm sure that there are differences between the two LMSs, that there are limitations on both sides, right? But I have not encountered anything with Cornerstone specifically that Workday can't do, but I have encountered many things that Workday does do in a different way. So it's not going to be an apples to apples comparison. You're talking about converting apples to oranges, right? And so that's where really converting those audiences over, looking at your learning content, looking at really the structure of your LMS, and having someone internally on your team can be really valuable if you're able to have someone that can speak to all of the nuances of Workday learning and like how could we actually structure this in Workday so that we give the same or better user experience. And I would also say don't get caught up on giving the same user experience. Get caught up on giving the best user experience, because a lot of clients, when they're converting from any LMS, but Cornerstone in particular, are really concerned with mirroring it as closely as possible. And that means you're now building a process in a system that works differently to mirror a process in a system that you chose to move away from for some reason, right? So rethink it. Think about like, how can we deliver this in Workday that makes the most sense?
So thanks everyone for your time this afternoon. Jessica, thanks for sharing your knowledge. We're happy to take follow-up questions as follow-up to the actual webinar. We'll be reaching out to you just to follow up and get a survey on how the webinar went, what you'd like to see in future webinars related to Workday learning or other subjects. But thanks a lot, everybody. Hope you have a good afternoon. I hope you glean some things that's helpful for you.
Thank you so much.